My name is James Mukey. I'm an eye surgeon, and I've been one for 30 years. And for 30 years, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes. Every year, I'm seeing more and more patients with eye disease due to diabetes, in particular type 2 diabetes, which is a preventable dietary disease related to the consumption of too much sugar. Could you imagine waking up one morning completely blind? It's impossible to comprehend, isn't it? One of my patients had this experience. His name is Neil Hansel, an everyday Aussie bloke with a wife and 4 kids. He constructs light machinery for a living, and he also has type 2 diabetes. And a few years ago, at the age of 50, diabetes changed his world forever. Unfortunately, he'd neglected his disease. He'd neglected his health, and he paid the price. He went to bed one evening with normal sight and woke up the next day blind in both eyes. One of my colleagues worked really hard to retrieve his sight. Unfortunately, it was too late. Neil was to spend the rest of his life in darkness. This is how Neil views the world these days.
Basically, I think I would describe it as seeing everything as emotion, not as an actual vision. The images, unfortunately, aren't clear. The images are basically what you see of a day through your eyes is what you see of a night through your eyes. So there's no clarity. I see black figures as people or animals or trees, just black onto a greyish background.
Neil lost his driving licence. He lost his independence. And he lost his ability to teach the javelin. It was a hobby that gave him so much pleasure. The thing that upsets Neil the most, though, is losing his ability to see the smiles, the beautiful smiles on the faces of his wife and grandkids. This is a picture of Neil's wife and grandkids. This is how he should see them. And this is the reality. Neil has been truly blinded by sugar. Diabetes causes damage to the blood vessels throughout the body, including the retina, the light-sensitive layer of tissue that lines the inside of the backs of our eyes. Diabetes gives rise to bleeding inside the eyes that can take away the eyesight in an instant and sometimes permanently. The important point is that nearly all of the vision loss and blindness due to diabetes is preventable or treatable. However, in order to avoid the blinding complications of diabetes, patients with this disease must have their eyes checked on a regular basis. However, in Australia, of the 1.7 million people who are estimated to have diabetes, more than half are not having these regular, all-important eye checks, sometimes with devastating results. And that's why diabetes is now the leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults in this country and the fastest-growing cause of blindness in Aboriginal people. Today, I'm going to talk to you about type 2 diabetes, why it arises, why it's a growing epidemic, and what we can do to slow the growth of this dietary disease, which is the greatest threat to our health system. Type 2 diabetes is related to the ingestion of too much sugar in our diet. And when we talk about sugar, we think of table sugar or sucrose. It's important to realise that sugar comes in other forms, in particular refined carbohydrates, foods such as white rice and the products made from white flour and white potatoes. These are pure starch, which are long chains of glucose, which are broken down into glucose when they reach the gut. So in essence, when we're consuming refined carbohydrates, we're consuming pure sugar. When glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, it triggers the release of the hormone insulin from the pancreas. And insulin helps move the glucose into every cell of our bodies where it's stored as an energy source. With persistent and excessive intake of sugar, the cells become full, and the overflow of glucose is taken up by the liver and stored as glycogen. When the glycogen stores are full, the liver starts converting the glucose into fat. When the production of fat by the liver outstrips the liver's ability to export it, the liver then starts to store the fat, and we develop what's called a fatty liver. The normal liver is a deep red colour, and you can see this fatty liver is yellow. It's suffused with fat. A great example of how a fatty liver develops comes from foie gras, the French culinary delicacy. Foie gras is created by force-feeding geese high-starch corn mash, and the fatty liver develops in these unsuspecting creatures within 2 weeks. In humans, with excessive fructose consumption, a fatty liver can develop within 2 months. Fructose is the molecule of sugar that gives sugary food and drinks their sweet flavour. It's not recognised as a foodstuff by the body, it has no nutritional value, and it doesn't trigger the release of insulin. As soon as it hits the liver, it's converted directly to fat, and so it is far more toxic than glucose in giving rise to type 2 diabetes. Ultimately, and through a complex metabolic process, it can take many years for humans to develop type 2 diabetes. In children, type 2 diabetes can develop within 2 years. Eventually, the liver becomes full of fat and can take no more in, and the excess fat is exported away as triglyceride, which is harmful to the body. Together with the high insulin level in the blood, it gives rise to the fatty plaques which clog the arteries, and this in turn gives rise to the many life-changing and life-threatening complications of type 2 diabetes. Blockage of the small blood vessels gives rise to impotence. It can also cause numbness of the hands and feet, which can sometimes manifest as intractable pain. And it can also give rise to kidney failure. And kidney failure often requires dialysis up to 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, in order to filter the blood. Blockage of the major blood vessels gives rise to gangrene of the lower limbs, necessitating amputation. In Australia, every year, close to 4,500 amputations are performed for complications of type 2 diabetes. Here's our friend Neil Hansel in hospital the day after his 9th amputation for gangrene of his left lower limb. And Neil has also had a heart attack. And type 2 diabetes can cause stroke. And so it's also a deadly disease. In fact, it's the 6th leading cause of death in our society. And it also plays a major role in the development of cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And type 2 diabetes is an incredibly expensive disease, costing our health system close to $20 billion every single year. How did this all come about? Humans are hardwired to love and seek out sweet things. It's an ancient survival mechanism that helped our early ancestors to survive extended periods of fasting, which were common in those days. It also allowed them to avoid bitter and potentially poisonous foods. Prior to the 1600s, sugar was an expensive commodity. It was the domain of healers and holy men, and an indulgence that could only be afforded by the wealthy and the powerful. Over the next 300 years, the rising availability and popularity of sugar due to the booming sugar trade led to diminishing costs, turning sugar from a luxury item to an everyday necessity. These days, sugar is cheap, and sugar is everywhere. Things took a turn for the worst in 1980 when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans was released. There had been a rise in heart disease in the decades after World War II, and based on no real scientific evidence, the guidelines recommended reducing our dietary fat to less than 30% and increasing our carbohydrates to 60%. And rather than see a downturn in heart disease soared, along with it type 2 diabetes. In fact, globally, there's been a 4-fold increase in type 2 diabetes since 1980. And this has been even more profound in some communities and countries. In China, for example, there's been a 10-fold increase in type 2 diabetes since 1980. And this is paradoxical because the Chinese diet is rich in refined carbohydrate in the form of white rice. What's happened in Asia in the last few decades is increasing sugar consumption, which currently amounts to about 5% every year. In the Aboriginal communities of Australia, there's been an 80-fold increase in type 2 diabetes over the past 4 decades. I find that deeply concerning. In Australia, there are now over 1,000 children and teens with type 2 diabetes. If we're going to call type 2 diabetes a dietary disease, then surely there's a dietary cure. It should be as simple as reducing the sugar in our diet. However, there are a number of factors that make this more difficult to achieve, and I call them the 5 A's of sugar toxicity: addiction, alleviation, accessibility, addition, and advertising. And let's look at these each in turn. Firstly, addiction. Sugar is a highly addictive substance it's been shown to be as addictive as nicotine. Like drugs, its consumption activates the reward center in our brains, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It's what makes us feel good. It's what makes us want to do it again. And it's what gives us those cravings. And like drugs, the more sugar we ingest, the more we need to give us that feel-good hit. It's a vicious cycle that's very hard to break. The second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress and to make us feel better when we're down. The third A is accessibility. Sugary products are quite literally everywhere these days. You can't walk into most service stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. And you can't check out from most supermarkets without being enticed by soft drinks and chocolates, often heavily discounted. The fourth A is addition. An astronomical amount of sugar is added to our food and drinks. In the United States, 75% of food and drinks have added sugar. I'm sure Australia is not far behind. And this becomes problematic in remote communities where sugary food and drinks are in abundance, and fresh, healthy foods are scarce and often very expensive. The fifth A is advertising. Our world is flooded for ads and commercials for sugary products, often in the most insidious of ways. And it's been going on for decades. To deal with this toxic impact of sugar, we're going to need resilience. Personal resilience, national resilience, and global resilience. Three of the key features of resilience are keeping a cool head, having a positive approach, and being innovative. I like to use the example of Mr. Spock from Star Trek when I talk about resilience. He has a very cool head, and I know what Spock would do. He'd look to the smoking epidemic to see what's causing its decline. Back when Spock first graced our screens, smoking was socially acceptable. In the years after World War II, something like 80% of all men smoked cigarettes. Have a look at this ad for candy cigarettes from the 50s. And look at the caption, "Just like Dad." The realisation of the health dangers of smoking in the 60s and the subsequent banning of advertising for cigarettes, the taxing of tobacco products, and the rollout of hard-hitting graphic awareness strategies such as these have all made smoking socially unacceptable. And as a result, smoking and smoking-related diseases and deaths are on the decline in most countries. We're going to have to use the same positive, resilient approach to the toxic impact of sugar and the growing threat of type 2 diabetes. We're going to need innovation to deal with these 5 A's of sugar toxicity. For addiction and alleviation, it's about personal awareness, being aware that sugar is highly addictive and that we're using it to alleviate stress in our lives. For accessibility, addition, and advertising, it's about accountability. Accountability of business, of industry, and of government. So let's look at these each in turn. Firstly, addiction. I'm sure that much of the world is addicted to sugar. I certainly was, and I'm sure I still am. The thing I love the most is ice cream. The bigger, the better. As a child, the worst punishment I could receive was to be sent to my bedroom after dinner without ice cream. And there's rarely been a day since when I haven't had ice cream after dinner each night. Sugar addiction can be beaten. For me, it was about giving up the heavily sweetened products in my diet, the fruit juices and soft drinks, the chocolate and candy, the biscuits and cake, and yes, the ice cream. I still want to go to a restaurant and be able to enjoy a delicious dessert. I still want to receive a mint chocolate frog for my birthday, and I still want to be able to enjoy the occasional ice cream. Just not every night. Giving up these heavily sweetened products did give me withdrawal symptoms. Headache, irritability, clouded thoughts, fatigue. They only lasted for about 3 days, and the cravings were pretty intense. But now I can walk past the fridge and not have to reach in and grab an ice cream. And I can walk past a cake at work and not have to take a slice or two. The second A is alleviation. Rather than reaching for a chocolate bar or a can of soft drink when you're feeling down, why not take the healthier option? Go for a run or a walk in nature, take a cycle, listen to your favourite musical playlist, watch a comedy, or do a good deed. These have all been shown to be as effective as sugar in countering the cortisol reaction that's flooding our body during anxious times. The third A is accessibility. Vending machines supplying sugary food and drinks should be removed from government buildings, schools and universities. And chocolate and soft drinks should be banned from checkout counters in supermarkets and stores. And the fourth A is addition. I can barely read those nutritional guidelines on the packets of our food, let alone understand them. And they certainly don't indicate the amount of added sugar contained within. I prefer a traffic light system where red means high sugar, don't buy. Amber means think twice, and green means safe to buy. It's a clear and transparent labelling system. In Australia, we've adopted the Health Star rating system, which I feel is flawed. It's flawed because it's voluntary, and what manufacturer would put a low-level rating on one of the foods it's trying to sell? And some products, such as orange juice, get a 5-star rating. A glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola. And this is where the contentious issue of taxing heavily sugared products comes in. However, there's some good reasoning behind it. In Australia, in the 10 years leading up to 2017, there was a 30% increase in the consumption of sugary drinks. And we know from a number of studies that there is a link between the consumption of sugary drinks and the development of type 2 diabetes. And we know from a number of countries that placing a levy on sugary drinks has resulted in a reduction in consumption. The final A is advertising. Commercials for sugary products should be removed from free-to-air TV during those times when our kids are watching. Ads for sugary food and drinks also should be removed from government office buildings and services such as trams and buses. And there's a predatory form of marketing which is preying on our addiction, preying on our withdrawal symptoms. This is immoral and absolutely has to stop. And what we need is a comprehensive strategy raising awareness amongst the public of the multitude of health dangers of sugar, obesity, tooth decay, type 2 diabetes. We also need positive messages that type 2 diabetes is a preventable dietary disease, and for many people, it's also reversible. The public needs to hear that natural fats in our diet have never been proven to cause cardiovascular disease. And indeed, a Mediterranean diet has been proven to reduce heart disease. It's time to see on free-to-air TV hard-hitting TV commercials that warn us of the serious complications of type 2 diabetes. Commercials such as this one.
I should have kept my medication up and I should have followed the plans that were given to me by my doctors. I woke up one morning completely blind. Thought I was dreaming, went back to sleep for an hour, woke up and I was still completely blocked off. My wife's face when we went to bed. That was the last clear image I had.
Ultimately, it's about education. These days, would you leave a packet of cigarettes on the kitchen counter for your children to enjoy? I'm sure you wouldn't. So why leave a bowl of sugary treats? We need to exchange that bowl of sugary treats for a bowl of nuts. We need to educate our kids, although we can't educate our kids until we know and understand ourselves. And how about those soft drinks in our fridge? Perhaps this is their gloomy future. I'm going to leave you with one last message from Neil Hansel, the day after his 9th amputation for gangrene of his left lower leg due to complications of his type 2 diabetes.
I had a little joke the other day and I put my hand up and I had a grain of sugar between my fingers and I said, meet my killer. And people were trying to see what was in my fingers and all it was 1 grain of salt, 1 grain of sugar. And that's what it takes. You know, we as a society, we have to do something. We've got to make people aware that the more sugar we intake, the worse this is going to get. And it's not good. It's not good.
As an eye surgeon, I never again want to see a patient who's blind due to complications of their type 2 diabetes. As doctors, we shouldn't be seeing the life-changing and life-threatening complications of a dietary disease that's entirely preventable. And as an Australian, I believe it's time to declare war on type 2 diabetes. Thank you.